I'm sitting in for Dominic Trembour, who unfortunately cannot be here, but I also want to thank him for helping us in preparing this conference. Unfortunately, cannot be here because he has to, on behalf of the Fondation de la Mémoire de la Shoah, he has to go to some other place. A short introduction of my person before I started or changed into managing a research institute. I was a historian myself, basically working in the field of contemporary Austrian and Hungarian history. I'm going to be very strict at this panel in time-wise because we need to leave this room at 18:30 because our sound assistant needs to move some of his equipment to our other venue where the literary presentation will be. And I'm going to be very impolite. I'm going to introduce you only very shortly, just saying your name and the title of your presentation, because all of you have a very extensive CV in your folder from the abstracts. And our first speaker is going to be Philip Carabott from the King's College in London, and he's a research associate at the King's College in London, where he teaches and taught modern Greek history, and he has the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair. Can you hear me? Good, excellent. So, it's always advantageous, as far as I'm concerned, to speak after almost 2 days of full, interesting discussions, papers, because it gives me the opportunity to reflect on what I have to say. The focus, as the title of course suggests, the focus of my presentation is on the anti-Semitic discourse in late 19th century Greece. I'm going to play a lot with words. You're going to see a number of extracts from anti-Semitic diatribes in the Greek press and in individual publications. And then I will try to kind of bring the threads together and analyze some of this discourse in an attempt to show not only the universalism of the anti-Semitic discourse, in the Greek case, but also some aspects of particularism. So, let's begin. Less than 5 years after Wilhelm Marr had founded the League of Anti-Semites in October 1879, the Athenian press carried an unsigned piece entitled "The Jews in Greece." According to this unauthored piece, in Athens, there was established a grand anti-Semitic committee with a threefold aim. I won't read out the three aims of the committee. You have them there. Little else is known so far about this committee. Yet, the fact that it had these very three specific aims should not be treated as immaterial. First of all, on the surface at least, the committee's generic aims are, if not identical, then certainly comparable to Marr's League of Anti-Semites. There is one interesting exception, namely that the Greek Anti-Semitic Committee does not put forward the idea of the expulsion of Jews from the Greek state. There's also another interesting point about these three aims, the specific reference to Salonika, Ottoman Salonika, as being Greek. Now, Ottoman Salonika was at the time and until the incorporation of the port city into the Greek state in 1912-1913, considered to be the Jerusalem of the Balkans. It had the most influential, both in terms of numbers, but also in terms of culture and in terms of a historical past, the most influential Sephardic community in the Balkan Peninsula, if not indeed in the whole of the continent. The reference to Ottoman Salonika as being Greek in my view at least, suggests, if nothing else, implies that for the members of this anti-Semitic committee, anti-Semitic league, the Jewish presence in Salonika was a threat to the implementation of Greek national or nationalistic aims. At the same time, the anonymous author refers to the existence of certain abuses that are taking place on the island of Corfu, as well as in other parts of the European continent, with specific reference to blood libel cases. The cue here is yet another blood libel case in Hungary in 1882, the trial of which takes place exactly the same time as this anonymous authored piece appears in the Greek press. Again, if nothing else, it shows the diffusion of certain ideas, be it anti-Semitic or not, doesn't really matter, into a Greek context. The Greek press, if one looks at the Greek press, and by Greek press I mean the Athenian press, mostly, of the time, one is surprised by the extent of the coverage that such cases is given in the columns of the Greek press. Granted, there isn't a lot of we don't know about the readership of the Greek press at the time, probably less than 5% of the total population. But the fact that the press placed so much emphasis on blood libel cases, on the emergence of anti-Semitic committees in parts of Europe, on what could be conveniently referred as the Jewish question, if nothing else, is indicative of a certain interest. Again, perhaps we have here an example of how an idea or ideas are diffused from main core Europe into Europe of the periphery. Excuse me. Okay. A third point that the anonymous author makes is about the swelling, the increase, in other words, in the numbers of the Jews living in the Greek state. I have tabulated some of this data. Obviously, this data is not very precise, it's not very, it is inclusive, but it's not very detailed or precise. But just looking at the numbers, 1861, the Jewish element, including the Muslim element, according to population census, is recorded as 0.5% of the total population. 1879, this goes up to 0.15%. 1881 to 0.35%. And at the turn of the century, 1907, to 0.23%. It's a minute, a tiny percentage overall. What this shows is that irrespective of the numerical weakness or strength, for that matter, of the Jewish element, and irrespective of its economic impotency, because most of the Jews, these 6,000 or 5,000 Jews living in the Greek state at the time, were not, unlike in the case of Jewish communities in parts of the Ottoman Empire, they did not have either a powerful economic financial base or indeed an intellectual base. Mostly were either menial workers or peddlers. And yet, the author makes sure that he poses the existence of this tiny, insignificant minority. He perceives it, and therefore the committee perceives it, as a threat. Just at the same time as this anonymous piece was published in the Greek press, in the Athenian popular press of the time, popular stroke satirical press of the time, one comes across this quote, extract. For me, this extract, this passage, shows that to be a Jew, in the eyes of the popular press at least, had come to encompass a set of negative characteristics and features, understandable, which transcended the religious and nationalistic charters of the distant and recent past, and this is a crucial point in my view at least, were arbitrarily attributed to known Jews as well. This passage refers to representatives of Greek, and by Greek here I mean Greek Orthodox, modernist circles, which are described thus. The well-known traditional stereotypes related to Jewish perceptions of Jewishness, of Jewish identity. Again, a threat, the alleged threat of the Judification of a Christian society. Before presenting some representative examples of the anti-Semitic discourse of late 19th century Greece, I would like to make just two general observations about Greek anti-Semitism as a whole. Be it in the late 19th century or the 20th century, Greek anti-Semitism did not develop into a fully fledged political movement. The armory on which an anti-Semitic power base could be built and flourish simply did not exist. That's the first observation. The second observation, this, a follow-up to the first one, does not suggest that anti-Semitism is alien to the Greek mentality and psyche, as Greek commentators, historians, politicians, diplomats have repeatedly and diachronically argued. Popular and everyday implicit anti-Semitism was rife in the 19th century and the 20th century, and it still is. Now, the anti-Semitic discourse of the late 19th century was carried out by an assorted group of individuals. Low-rank clerics turned into bigoted preachers, men and women of letters turned into Jew haters, well-read journalists and informed citizens who were concerned by the alleged increasing power of Judaism. They were influenced mostly by the works of well-known core European anti-Semites, and at least some had established links in terms of communication, correspondence, with some representative examples of core European anti-Semites, for example, Edouard Rimond. It is, I think, useful to note here that these men and women, there are women among the Jew-eaters, carried neither weight with the centers of power, nor had access to any decision-making mechanisms. Yet, at the level of the local society, their anti-Semitic diatribes did find fertile ground. On the island of Corfu, for example, the literati turned local politician, a chap by the name of Polilas, had repeatedly and unambiguously admitted that an essential part of the Orthodox Greeks' mission was to fight the Jews. This is in 1885. And he gives a kind of account as to why this should be part of the Orthodox Greeks' mission. I don't think I should comment further on this, just to note, to underline this imagery of an element of the Jewish element that allegedly erodes the guts of Hellenism like a poisonous worm. Without a shred of a doubt, his Polylas's incessant anti-Semitic ranting did lay the ground for bringing out on the streets the riffraff against the island's Jews in the spring of 1891, in what is known as the Corfu riots. In my view, it's the pogrom of Corfu, when what started as a kind of a contrived blood libel accusation turned into a pogrom which lasted for a good 6 weeks in the late spring, early summer of 1891. This is a typical account given in the report, in the final report of the Greek Orthodox public prosecutor of Corfu on the incidents, on the pogrom, where he writes that habitually mobs would enter the Jewish district, injuring, beating, calling the Jews names, shooting them, and spreading fear and terror. What makes the Corfu pogrom of 1891 stand out from past anti-Semitic incidents was not solely their breadth and scope, but the unmistakably modern or modernist rationale that was put forward to justify what, again, Polylas himself referred to as the disturbances. Don't worry, I'll say a few words. My reading of this, don't worry. Okay. In this public expose, one comes across a series of accusations leveled against Corfu Jews, and by inference against Jewry as a whole. We have charges of self-imposed isolation, of foreignism and anti-patriotism, of disloyalty and economic exploitation, of indiscriminate Jewish ingratitude. All these charges and accusations and their attendant imagery, again, imagery is crucial here, are employed in order to construct a narrative which, on the one hand, justifies the pogrom, and on the other, presents antisemitism as, quote, a natural reaction of modern societies, unquote, against the threat of worldwide Jewish domination. Though the anti-Semitic discourse of Jew eaters in late 19th century Greece was not explicitly racially based, it did feed on negative notions of Jewish unnaturalness. We heard something about the previous session about this, and of non-reversible inhuman biological traits. Let us now consider the following two extracts from diatribes published in the Athenian press a year earlier, in 1890, on the morrow of the establishment of the so-called Israelite Brotherhood of Athens. which was the first non-Orthodox Christian association of the country that was de facto and de jure recognized and financially supported by the government. Responding to the express view of two theologians, both university professors, that the blood libel legend was pure and simple nonsense, one of the Jew eaters, this chap, opined that in light of the, quote, well-founded, unquote, and manifold demonstrated, quote, hatred of the Jews towards the Christians, unquote, this could not be so. And in what amounted to an unequivocal perception of Jews as the unnatural people par excellence, he concluded thus: to this very simplistic kind of, it's not even an argument, a reason, this very simplistic line of reasoning, one should also note the following, a follow-up by the fellow Jew eater, a woman, Maria Michanidou, author of one theatrical play and one fictional account on the alleged Jewish practice of sacrificing humans. Again, this was in response to what these two theologians, both university professors, had to say about the blood libel legend. A year later, singing from the same hymn suite, the journalist, chap by the name of Kasimatis, the fourth public figure of Greek Antisemitism quartet, would exclaim that it was high time for the government to rescind all civic rights and privileges that so unscrupulously it had given to the Jewish race. And he ended his plea: the Jewish race, which sucks the blood, I don't think I have this on, I have it. The Jewish race, which sucks the blood and the vitality of each and every people, the Jewish race, which has as its religious doctrine the hatred of mankind. Some final kind of concluding remarks. The anti-Semitic discourse of the quartet and its followers, particularly among sections of the press, both the decent press and the popular press, conceived of and proposed a Greece at worst free of Jews, at best with an even smaller number of disenfranchised and ghettoized Jews who would eventually be forced to leave the country. In this respect, little did their worldview differ from that of other anti-Semites elsewhere, be it in Europe's center or periphery. Where Greek anti-Semitism, or the anti-Semitic discourse of the time, diverges slightly from much of the European norm, and perhaps 19th-century Polish anti-Semitism might also be the exception here, is in the increasing emphasis it places on the conception and projection of Jewry as the perpetual, implacable enemy of Greece and the Greek diaspora. This indeed is a very Hellenocentric standpoint. But because of it, the country's tiny community of Jews and their genial patrons, in inverted commas, were repeatedly called upon to answer for the sufferings that Hellenism, the Greek nation, the Greek people, had to endure because of the non-Hellenic behavior of the Jews' co-religious in Germany, in Romania, in the Ottoman Empire, in Egypt, and further afield. And to condemn their alleged wrongdoings should they wish to remain in a country that, quote, unselfishly was extending them its hospitality, end of quote. And since we are in Vienna, let me finish with an extract from the Vienna correspondent, the one Athenian mainstream newspaper, who went one step further. Writing on the moral of Dreyfus' pardon and the audacious move of a hotel owner in downtown Athens to rename his establishment into Dreyfus in October 1889, this chap addressed Greek readers, and particularly Greek youth, thus. Fortunately, his battle cry went unheeded. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you. We are almost on time, and I pass on the floor to our next speaker, Dimitrios Varvaritis. He holds a MA in history from the London School of Economics and earned a PhD in 2014 at the King's College, but he is now an independent researcher specializing in the history of European anti-Semitism and Greek Jewry, and you have the floor.
Thank you. Okay. Can you hear me? Yes? Before I start, I wish to thank the organizers, Béla and Eva, for their kind invitation and for organizing specifically a conference on the periphery and anti-Semitism. It is much, much, much needed. And as someone who's researched for his doctoral thesis, anti-Semitism in Greece, a peripheral country, it is something that is, again, much needed. This paper is concerned with, as its title indicates, the dissemination and by extension the reception and diffusion of the central ideas of an anti-Semitic tract entitled, and you can see it in the abstract, the original Greek is Anatropή της θρησκείας των Εβραίων. That's the short title. It's much, much longer, and it goes into nearly 30 words or more in the original text. I won't read it out, but we can discuss it later. This particular paper is an outgrowth of my doctoral thesis on anti-Semitism in Greece in the 19th century, and it's in many ways still a work in progress. That said, one may ask, and I believe justifiably so, what is the point of studying and researching this particular work, this particular text, given its marginality and the fact that, one would say, who would read such nonsense, if I can use such a word. But given, however, the sheer numbers involved, in terms of editions, I mean, and to my mind, the number of editions is a relatively large number. In total, we're talking about 11 Greek editions from 1818 to 1906. In languages other than Greek, we're talking about 17 editions, 9 of which I've recognized through my research as being in Romanian and in other languages of the Eastern Mediterranean, which include Arabic, Karamanlivika. Karamanlivika was a language developed in Ottoman Turkey, which was basically Ottoman Turkish written with a Greek alphabet. One edition in there, and as well as French, Dutch, Italian, and I may have mentioned earlier Arabic, I can't remember now. I believe that these editions, and let me say what I mean by edition, that these editions, I mean any reprinting of the original 1818 Greek text or the analogous Romanian one of 1803 as constituting, or a substantial amount of that original text as constituting an edition. I believe that this constitutes a corpus, and this particular corpus cannot be overlooked and simply relegated to a footnote in academic studies about anti-Semitism. This paper thus aims to do two things: to understand and contextualize the Greek part of this corpus, and to place its reception and the like within two overlapping parameters: the Neo-Hellenic or Balkan Orthodox Enlightenment, and the development and culturally, intellectually of the Greek nation-state. Secondly, it aims to challenge the notion of Greek exceptionalism vis-à-vis anti-Semitism in Greece. My colleague Philip has already shown many in his particular paper, many extracts from anti-Semitic diatribes. But despite that, there is an idea and a rhetoric and a discourse, even today in Greece, that Greece is a country and constitutes a case where anti-Semitism never existed, that such things, and when violence against Jews living within Greece occurred, it could be attributed to the Ottoman past, or in the case of the Ionian Islands, the Venetian past of this particular part of Greece. In short, my research posits the thesis that modern anti-Semitism within the Greek-speaking and overlapping Orthodox worlds was premised on a two-way traffic in ideas between the center and periphery, and not necessarily on a linear transfer from center to periphery. Moving on, the practical aspects, the sources. The sources that I've used are the actual editions themselves. In the case of the Greek corpus, 11 editions, their prefaces, and other material attached to them as the decades progressed and they were being reissued. Contemporaneous materials such as newspaper articles which discuss them. My methods are not particularly sophisticated. I've used the recognized reference works for the bibliography of Greece, specifically the Elliniki Bibliografia, or Greek bibliography of Polemi and Iliou. In the Romanian case, I've used the bibliography produced by Tzvi Hartman. For the Bulgarian editions, articles by Todorova and Kulenska. For the Karaman-Lidika, an article by Johann Strauss, not the composer, a different one. A philologist at Strasbourg University. The very long bibliographical hand list produced by the Anglo-Australian Jewish scholar Joseph Jacobs, called The Jewish Question, 1885. I'm sorry for enumerating all these things, but it's important to bring that out, I think, as well, to where all this has come from. The additional list produced by Isidore Loeb and published in the Revue des Études Juives in the late 1880s, Émile Legrand's 5-volume Bibliographie Hellénique, and Moritz Steinschneider's long list of anti-Jewish literature in Italian. Having already enumerated above more or less the aims, methods, and the like, one may have the impression that this work is absent from the pertinent scholarly output. Literature specifically on Neofytos is rare, but it's not non-existent. The work particularly of Mina Rosen, of two Israeli academics or scholars. Mina Rosen, her large history of the Ottoman Jewry, various articles by Ritzak Kerem, a Greek history of the Jews of Southeast Europe by Maria Efthymiou, and an article by Violeta Barbu discuss at length, in varying degrees, this particular work. It's worth noting that the work of Catherine Fleming, the recent work, Greece, a Jewish History, does not mention it, neither does Bernard Pierron's History of Anti-Semitism in Greece. Even the history by Esther Ben-Bassa and Arno Rodriguez, despite their discussion of the blood libel within the Ottoman Empire, do not discuss this particular work. Again, I don't need to mention the work of people like Jakob Katz or Lindemann, Albert Lindemann and Richard Levy. Again, for obvious reasons, their focus is Germanocentric, and I don't wish to go into the reasons for it, but in any case, that should be underscored as well. The initial edition of 1803, it appeared in Iași in Moldavia. There is some doubt whether the particular author, Neofytos, actually existed or not. There is some confusion. In his memoirs, the Romanian Jewish historian Jakub Santir, and I hope I pronounced that correctly, talked about his father working for the consul of France in Iași in the early 19th century and having intervened with the authorities to get the book destroyed or burnt or taken out of circulation. There is other work as well by Ariadna Comarianu, who discusses this particular work and the confusion around it. I won't go into the details, but there is some literature on it. According to Violeta Barbu and her article, its appearance and the violence which ensued after it, because there were apparently some riots in the town of Iași in 1803, should be seen within the Frankist movements of the period, their legacies. They should also be seen within the context of the circulation within the Romanian lands of various occult texts in manuscript form or in published form within Transylvania and Moldavia. And it should also be seen within the context of the republication in both Greek and in Romanian of another anti-Jewish or, in any case, anti-Semitic work called the Epistle of Rabbi Samuel of Morocco, which is a 14th century text initially published and appeared under the pen of Alfonso Bonhombre, a Spanish Dominican friar, through the centuries since 1339 when it first appeared. It's been translated, and according to an article by Aura Limor, and I agree with her, it was a bestseller for its period. To Barbu's formulation, I would add also the fact that in the 18th century, within the context of the Neo-Hellenic or Balkan Enlightenment, we have a translation of an Italian convert to Christianity, Paolo de' Medici. His work, Riti e costumi degli ebrei descritti e confutati, which simply means rites and customs of the Jews described and confuted, in other words, refuted. That appeared at least in 3 editions. I've located 2 Greek editions. What's important about this particular work is that it, in a sense, is a rebuttal to an earlier work, that by the Italian rabbi Leone da Modena and his history of Hebraic rituals, published in Venice in 1637. That's a particular point which I wish to bring out in the sense that because the Greek editions of Neofytos' tract extract and include parts of Paolo de' Medici's work as well. So in a sense, through Neofytos, we have a connection to an older tradition or a discourse within European Jewish history whereby Jews such as Leone de Modena and earlier people such as Manasseh ben Israel in the case of England and Oliver Cromwell and the like, we have a tradition whereby Jews explain to the non-Jewish world their world, and moreover they publish and speak about it in the language of the non-Jewish population. In the case of Leone da Modena, Italian; in the case of Manasseh ben Israel, in English. Now, the actual Greek texts. How are we going for time? We have time. Okay. 10 minutes. This section we're actually going to deal with the actual Greek texts. And before I start that, I should actually say, I'll give a brief rundown of the non-Greek editions. And I'll be very brief about this. Romanian, 1803 in Iași, 1839 Iași again, 1871 Iași, 1873 Bucharest, 1876 Bucharest, 1877 Bucharest, 1871 again Bucharest, 1922 Bucharest, 1935 Bucharest. In Bulgarian, 1839 Salonika, Thessaloniki, however you wish to call it. 1885, Plovdiv. Arabic, 1840, Aleppo. And again, the Damascus blood libel was occurred in that particular year. 1869, Beirut. Italian, 1883. French, 1889. Dutch, 1883. Karamanlivika in 1857. So immediately I'm trying to bring in a context and a geography to this whole issue. Now, this section, I want to deal with the actual Greek text. I'm not going to discuss the content of it. One can look at, there are many of you here that can read Italian and French and many other languages. One can see the content in one word. It can be summarized as simply the blood libel and various tales concerning the blood and how it's used by Jews. But more importantly, there is this issue that the sacrifice of children by Jews is done by a specific sect of Judaism, and it's a secret transferred from father to son. The Greek translations. We have the first one in 1818, which is produced in Yashi, and within the long title there is a reference to the fact that a merchant, and a very honorable one, as the Greek originally says, Timiotatou en pragmateftes, paid for this particular edition. Again, that's before the creation of the Greek state in 1833, and again in the context of a merchant diaspora, and according to the established literature and the conventional narrative that we have of the Neo-Hellenic Enlightenment, merchants in the merchant diaspora of Greece or the countries of the Balkans were purveyors of knowledge through their sponsorship of publications, of various publications. 1834, we have an edition in Constantinople and printed at the patriarchal typography, the patriarchal printing press. That shouldn't go without, that's an important point as well. 1834, the city of Nafplio. Greeks became independent in 1833, Nafplio became its capital. In 1835, a year later, again in Nafplio. In 1861, we have two editions in Corfu and Zante. In both these cases, one should emphasize the fact that at that particular point, the Jews of the Ionian Islands had started producing a newspaper and had started propagandizing, or perhaps their emergence into the public sphere had occurred in the late 1850s and early 1860s, when they published a newspaper calling for full emancipation rights and calling on the British, who were the colonial occupiers or overlords, however you wish to call it, of the Ionian Islands, to grant them full citizenship rights. 1866, again in Athens. 1866, another one in Athens. 1882, a third edition in Athens. 1891, Patras. 1891, in Patras. Again, Philip referred to the blood libel and the context of people like Michanidou and Petros Kasimatis. 1906, in Athens. So, in summary, I wanted to say that despite the number of editions, there is a remarkable stability in the reproduction of the text. Of all the 11 editions that I have, 10 reproduce the Paolo Medici extracts, 6 reproduce the epistle of Samuel the Rabbi of Morocco, 9 reproduce the same phraseology, anatropy, which in Greek can basically mean overthrow, but can also mean reversal. It has these meanings, and we can perhaps discuss this in the Q&A later. Because I'm conscious of time, how am I going with time? 5 minutes. All right, I have time. Okay. I have a lot to cover, and I don't want to. All right. Furthermore, they all include the introductory letter initially published in the 1818 edition by the most honorable, as it referred to, merchant Georgios Gatsos, in which he says, and I quote, "Of all the books we have concerning the religion and superstitions of the Jews, no other reveals so clearly the most confidential secrets and fallacies of the Jews than this one." again, I want to make this connection between the Neofytos Tract and Paolo Medici, and through that to Leone da Modena. But again, I also don't want to overlook the issue of context, of timing, and of appearance. 1861, 1891, the significant points within the broader development of Jews within the Greek state. The Greek state and its development throughout the 19th century was a case of Greece, in inverted commas, inheriting Jews through its territorialist, expansionist ideology, its nationalism. Coming to a conclusion. My paper has attempted in quite a schematic and preliminary manner to explore and contextualize the Greek language corpus of this particular tract. Much work remains to be done, especially in going back and looking at the newspaper press, the Greek of the time, to see what else was potentially written at the time in terms of the discussion of this particular tract. One also needs to go back and look at how this particular work was received in Western Europe. Two particular leads are particularly important. The case of the Roman Catholic, basically the Jesuit Italian periodical Civiltà Cattolica, which extracted and discussed the Neofytos Tract, and the analogous one in France, Les Questions Actuelles. And closing, I want to again leave you with a sense of transfer. I want to question more or less the argument put forward by historians such as Bernard Lewis in his Semites and Anti-Semites, where he talks about Arabic, for example, anti-Semitism being an import through the Christian Arab element, which had its traditional links to France, through the Maronites, the Melkites, and the other Greek Catholic and Greek Orthodox elements within that confessional group. But I also want to see the implications of this particular work for the history of how we write the history of the Jews in Southeast Europe, and how we try to understand where the influences were, how they were viewed, and the like. And to quote a colleague and a paper that I heard recently at another conference in Paris, Damien Guillaume, he referred to the idea of the need to construct a nouvelle géographie, as he said, d'antisémitisme. I hope I have, in my own way, tried to do that. I thank you for your patience.
Thank you. You're perfect in time management. And we go on to the last presentation from Maria Vassilikou, one vocal away from our deputy mayor of Vienna, and it's very hard, Vassilikou. I have to concentrate on that. She studied in Athens, London, and Jerusalem, and she received her doctorate from the University College of London. The title of her presentation is "The Jews Left in Salonika Before the Second World War, Caught in the Crossfire Between Antisemitism and Anticommunism." The floor is yours.
Thank you, Béla. Thank you very much, both all organizers, for giving me the chance to come to Vienna, to this wonderful institute, and have the chance to listen to and profit from many diverse, interesting papers. By the end of the 19th century, the forces of modernization and nationalism, which had already swept over Western Europe, reached Ottoman Salonika. As Philip before said, it was known to many as Jerusalem of the Balkans, and to all of the people due to its numerically Jewish population, and for others was known as the melting pot par excellence of the various ethnic groups in the region. At this time, by this threshold to the 20th century, numerous public works modernized the city's infrastructure, economic activity boomed, urban population increased, and political activism became the order of the day. My paper today will mainly focus on the key role of the Salonika-born Jewish left for the course of Jewish and non-Jewish politics, ever since its emergence in 1909 and until 1936, when the Metaxas dictatorship brought an end to democratic values and silenced all free-minded political voices. While my paper unfolds, we will have the chance to trace and assess the role of antisemitism for the track of Jewish socialist politics in Greece throughout the period under consideration. By 1910, around 120,000 people were breathing the humid air of this port city. Amongst them, we count roughly 60,000 Sephardic Jews, 25,000 Muslims, 20,000 Greeks, 10,000 Bulgarians, while no less than 5,000 people were carrying Serbian, German, Italian, French, American passports. As striking as the numerical predominance of the Jewish community was the social composition of its members, ranging from bourgeoisie and high bourgeoisie to proletarian and lumpenproletarian. Amongst the 20,000 people of different ethnic origins who were busy working in the newly emerged industrial sector of Thessaloniki, 3/4 were Sephardic Jews, employed as tobacco workers, shop assistants, carpenters, printers, soap makers, and many port workers. All these were working in conditions far from being ideal. However, the formation of a social conscience amongst this numerically strong working class, probably the only proletarian force in the entire Sephardic world, has been delayed due to different factors. Successive periods of national delirium, which had driven Greeks and Bulgarians and other ethnic groups to so many bloody escapades throughout the second half of the 19th century, held all forces back, social forces back from organizing themselves. At the same time, the socially antiquated character of the Ottoman regime had slowed down the building process of westernized forms of social organization. This social scape changed dramatically in the light of the Young Turks Revolution, which in its early phase was characterized by a spirit of liberalism. The 25-year-old Bulgarian Jewish activist Avraham Benaroya came to Salonika in the early 1900s, where he started working as a printer and teacher in the Jewish schools. The ground was fruitful for social action. As of 1904, a period of social unrest was well underway. Together with two other Jews from Salonika, David Rekanati and Joseph Hazan, as well as with the Bulgarian Alexander Tomov and the Macedonian Dimitra Vlahov, grounded in 1909 the Fédération Socialiste Ouvrière de Salonique. In the long-winded first article of its statutes, we read that the goal of the Federation was the organization of the proletarian on the way to the implementation of the socialist ideals. The multi-ethnic composition of the organization was only mentioned in the third article and rather telegraphically. Shortly after its birth, the Federation was recognized by the Second International based in Brussels. Its mouthpieces were La Solidaridad Obrader and, as of 1911, Avanti, printed by 1912 in 5,000 copies. The Federalista Socialista Elaboradera had a youth branch and its own drama group performing theatrical pieces in Judeo-Spanish. Although the Jewish predominance within the Federation did reflect the numerical superiority of the Jews in Salonika, it did not lead to its Verjudung. how can we say that? I don't know.
Judification.
Yes, Judification. Being Jewish was simply viewed as one of many ethnic identities within the melting pot of the Socialist Federation, which did not care to place any national or ethnic question in the center of its political line. Copying in a way the Austrian socialists Karl Renner and Otto Bauer, the Federation privatized, so to say, the national question into an issue of personal autonomy, advocating, I quote, that the ethnic character of every citizen was a matter of personal choice. The solution which the Jewish federalists proposed was federalism, namely a formation which all the nationalities could belong to without having to give up either their language or their culture. So far, so good, given the continued existence of the Ottoman regime, whose very raison d'etre had been nominally and practically compatible to federal forms of organization. It would not take long, however, for the Jewish socialists to realize that their federal discourse was not in tune with the mounting nationalism in the Balkans. The first serious blow against this federal orientation of Salonika Jewish socialists was dealt in the aftermath of the First World War, of the First Balkan War in 1912. The victorious Greek troops entered the city which had nourished Greek national aspirations in the Macedonian region ever since. As far as the Federation was concerned, the strike was double. For one, antisemitism, which until that moment has not been an issue in Salonika, showed its ugly face with violence acts, albeit in a rather restricted scale, affecting all Jews, irrespective of class origins or political affiliation. For another, the preference of the socialist organization for a federal solution with regard to the national question was interpreted by Greek officials as clandestine work in favor of the autonomy of Macedonia. The clash with Greek national discourse and its representatives was as good as certain. The worried voices of the Salonican Jewish socialists are heard clear and loud when reading their correspondence with the International Bureau in Brussels. In the embroilment of the social unrest which broke out in the winter of 1914, the socialist press accused Greek authorities of intimidating and oppressive politics, amongst others of numerous arrests, citing now the arrest of the Jewish socialist leaders Samuel Arditi, Samuel Yona, and Abraham Benaroya, not least because of its Bulgarian descent. Although the evidence is yet to be found, one could rather safely assume that the increasingly growing hostile atmosphere convinced Salonican socialists to look for new allies in the Greek socialists based in Athens. The position of the Jewish community became even more critical following the outbreak of the First World War, which set at stake Greece's entry to war. The socialist-minded Jews advocated neutrality. Once again, they were heading for confrontation against the political line of Eleftherios Venizelos, the Greek statesman whose very name had been a synonym of Greek nationalism and irredentism, and who did his best to bring Greece on the side of the Entente. No wonder that in the 1915 elections, the Jewish socialists, along with the overwhelming majority of the other Salonika Jews, voted against Venizelos. This so-called anti-nationalist electoral behavior left an additional stain on the profile of the Federation in the eyes of the Venizelists, who in the years to come would strive to eliminate communist activists under the pretext of national threat. The Great Fire of August 1917, which destroyed the largest part of the historic center and left almost 1/3 of the Jewish population of the city homeless, rendered, as expected, socialist ideas even more attractive. Indeed, as a result of the new plan for the reconstruction of the town, more than 1/3 of Salonika Jews were forced to move to certain suburbs under miserable housing conditions. I quote, "These ghetto-like peripheral settlements became in the years to come both the strongholds of the Jewish left and the target of local Greek antisemitism. End of quote. This spatial concentration of Jewish population was also doomed to facilitate the Germans in their murderous plans in 1943, when approximately 45,000 Jews from Salonika were within 6 months deported to Auschwitz. Enfeebled by natural catastrophes and surrounded by Greek nationalists, Salonika Jewish socialists decided to join the other Greek socialists on a national scale and thus enlarge their sphere of influence all over Greece. In 1929, in May, the now United Federation and Greek Socialist Party, the so-called SEKE, joined the Communist International. The year 1923 marked a turning point in the history of the Jewish socialist movement in Salonika, mainly due to two reasons. On the one hand, the exchange of population, which came on the heels of the Lausanne Treaty and brought more than 80,000 destitute Greek refugees in the city, caused severe social, economic, and cultural disruptions in the hitherto rather relaxed modus vivendi between Greeks and Jews. As a result, economic antagonism between the two Greeks, Jews and non-Jews, mainly the refugees, intensified, social tensions rose, and antisemitism found its way in the press. On the other hand, the inclusion of the national question in the agenda of the Third International, in 1924, the Greek Communist Party spoke openly of an independent Macedonia which would bring ethnic liberty and the end of bourgeois suppression, intensified the well-known Greek anti-communist discourse, which culminated in the voting of the infamous Idiomon law in 1929. Due to their double identity as Jews and as communists, the Jewish socialists in Salonika were caught, as said, in the crossfire of interwar antisemitism and anti-communism. This was a new situation asking for a new position, and the answer was to be found in the Communist Greek Party's recent endorsement of the popular national question. The Jewish socialists took this national question motto by chapter and verse and immediately integrated into their political program. They rediscovered anew their Jewishness and were thus entitled to play their strongest card, namely the unique ethnic particularity of Salonika Judaism, which stood beyond any doubt. Indeed, until late 1920s, Salonican Jews had not reached any worth mentioning degree of linguistic assimilation and cultural integration. The interwar Greek state was lacking both an affluent national fund and a determined central authority, which were and still are the prerequisites of any serious state-run integration plan. To be more precise, Greek majority policies towards Salonika Jews, when considered all together, had an opportunistic and erratic character, sending at this time and those years contradictory messages to the Jews as far as their position in Salonika was concerned. Sermons in favor of assimilation were seriously undermined by antisemitism. Official recognition of the Jews as a religious minority was muddied by the endorsement of a separate electoral college, a measure which attributed to them implicitly the characterization of a national minority. Official declarations assuring the Jews of cultural tolerance were invalidated by the passing of the Sunday closing law and the moves to expropriate the Jewish cemetery. However, for the Venizelist initiators of these measures, these policies made perfect sense, as they were only simple means serving the one and only goal of state building in interwar Greece, namely the rehabilitation of the Asia Minor refugees and B, the assimilation of the new lands which Greece had annexed in the course of the Balkan Wars. How did the Jewish communists respond to these frustrating messages? They sought to discard all clouds of frustration with a clear and loud verdict. Greek official policies were socially unjust, culturally hostile, and politically oppressive. In 1925, the Jewish communists protested thus vehemently against the passing of the law, which violated the Jewish Sabbath and imposed Sunday as the obligatory closing day in Salonika. This was by no means a proof of religiosity, as the Jewish left made no bones about its atheism. Their protest was rather triggered by economic considerations, as this measure would enfeeble the Jewish working class. 15 years ago, the Bundists themselves in Russia had asked the Russian government to grant the population the right to choose their own day of rest, Friday for Muslims, Saturday for Jews, and Sunday for Christians. The Jewish communists placed extra emphasis on the institutional pillars of Jewish ethnic particularity in Salonika, namely the communal assembly, which was characterized as the parliament, and the communal council, which was characterized as the community's ministry. The Jewish communist mouthpiece Avanti remonstrated always very loud when state subventions for communal institutions were reduced and accused the Greek state of trying to exterminate the Jewish communal work, end of quote. At the same time, the Jewish communists proved their loyalty to the Greek Communist Party and in turn to the Third International, which viewed the Jewish question as a subcategory of a broader national question and sounded the note of warning for both the Turkish and Armenian minorities who, in the eyes of the Jewish communists, were bound to suffer sooner or later the consequences of the same Greek intolerant policies. As far as, I quote, the enemy from within is concerned, the Jewish communists were adamant when criticizing the Zionist communal leaders of mishandling of communal affairs and of leading in of corruption scandals. Even antisemitism, the Jewish issue par excellence, was not seen as a specifically Jewish problem, but as a typical case of ethnic hostility within a bourgeois state. The attacks in the local nationalist press in Thessaloniki, just to name Macedonia, Fos, Aggelioforos, against Salonika Jews throughout the interwar years had become, if I may to say so, a sad normality. By drawing very often its motives from the available anti-Semitic discourse, which Philip and Dimitrios have just mentioned, they cultivated antipathy and mutual suspicion between Jews and non-Jews. Moreover, the emergence of the fascist organization 3 Epsilon, National Union and LAS in 1927 made interethnic relations even more explosive. In June 1939, on the heels of anti-Semitic writings of Macedonia, this paper, which accused Salonika Jews inter alia of the national crime par excellence, namely working for the autonomy of Macedonia, member of the fascist organization 3 Epsilon launched a pogrom against the Jewish neighborhood of Campbell, leading to casualties and many material damages. In Avanti, the Jewish socialist mouthpiece, we read that the Campbell riots were typical cases of national oppression compared to the ones committed against other minorities, such as the Slavo-Macedonians. However, for the sake of not endangering the alliance with the Greek working class, Avanti rushed to add that Greek workers have done their best to warn the Jews of the imminent danger. The answer of the Jewish communists, as I said, to what they perceived as an increasingly hostile environment was a self-confident and socially active Jewish community. They insisted upon the use of the Judeo-Spanish language as the characteristic of Salonika Jewishness par excellence. Since Salonika Jews inhabited the same territorial space with other oppressed minorities, the representatives of the Jewish left called for a united front of all oppressed social, ethnic, and political groups, ready to fight a bitter struggle on the spot against the oppressive Greek bourgeoisie. For this reason, they rejected all siren calls, bringing Jews outside Salonika's high walls, regardless of whether these callings drove them to a new homeland as France, Switzerland, South America, where they spoke the language, or even to the Zionist blessed high walls of Jerusalem. In my paper today, I want to sum up, I chose to lay emphasis not so much on the obvious, namely on the call of the Salonika Jewish left in favor of the interests for a struggle for the interests of the working class in word and deed. I rather focused on the way in which the old activists of the Federation played their strongest political card, namely the deeply rooted awareness of Salonika Jews of their unshakable, strong ethnic identity, inextricably interwoven with the history of the city itself. This political recipe was deeply crowned by success. In all electoral showdowns, both at a communal and a national level, the Salonika Jewish left attracted a stable number of votes, ranging from 15 to 20%. Their heyday was in the national elections of 1926, when they received almost 40%, thus enjoying an undisputed precedence over their Greek non-Jewish comrades, who even at their best times, their performance was poorly rewarded with a merely 5% of the votes. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Okay, no, you're good. Thank you very much for this final case study within the case study. And I forgot to inform you that this panel was proposed as a panel. Obviously, when we put together the program, we tried not to put the emphasis on regional or national questions, but we're very much problem-oriented. So this was the only panel which basically was a case study presented in 3 talks, which obviously were tuned and synchronized in a way, so the whole problem is presented in the panel. I won't lie, I'm not a specialist on Greek history, and my knowledge on Greek history is very fragmented, but so I first of all learned a lot now at the panel, but nevertheless, for me at least, there were a whole load of questions coming up, which I think need to be clarified, or at least to be opened up and talked about. But before I start with my questions, I pass on the floor to you and ask you to pose your questions.
Thank you. I have a question for Philip. And I was wondering why did this certain group, it's a self-referential question, why did these anti-Semites focus on the Jewish population, given the fact that there were so few of them living in Greece, if I understood the numbers correctly? And or did they also focus on or target other groups of the population, other minorities? So how is anti-Semitism linked to other forms of xenophobia or racism within the Greek society? Which is the standing of anti-Semitism in Greek society?
Yes, thanks for the question. These 3 guys and 1 woman, focus specifically, exclusively on the minute Jewish element of the country, but also on Jewry worldwide. To the best of my knowledge, they did not utter a single word about other minority groups in the Greek state, be it of the Muslim faith or of heterodox Christians, Catholics, and the few even much smaller than even the Jewish element, the evangelics. Thank you, Dimitrios. Why they focus only on the Jews? Well, I guess that has to do with the timing. The timing was perfect because the Jewish question in its modern dimension was really taking huge strides in continental Europe, or rather in core Europe. And it was something, in my view, I cannot substantiate or document this view yet, so I'll refer to it just as a hypothesis. However cruel and pedantic as it might sound, it was fashionable to be an anti-Semite in the late 19th century. Thank you.
Paul and then Brendan.
Thank you for I learned a lot from the panel myself. I didn't know much about anti-Semitism in the Greek-speaking world. So I have a number of questions for each of you. Sorry about that. I mean, I'm going to try to keep them very specific and punctual. So the first thing that struck me in Philip's presentation is this notion of the reference to the Greek political elite as in terms of greedy as Jews, disloyal as Jews, cunning as Jews. It's a targeting of non-Jews with characteristics that are typically ascribed to Jews. And that's something that one encounters very often in political rhetoric and into Romania as well. It's targeting the political class by using the Jews as a proxy. It's, I guess, along the lines of what Shulamit Volkov has called antisemitism as a cultural code. You're not targeting actual Jews, you're targeting a different group by ascribing to them characteristics or this notion of Jewification, of being in the service of Jews. And I wonder if you can comment a bit on that. Maybe that was the function that antisemitism fulfilled in a country with such a low percentage of the Jewish population, on top of the fact that it was fashionable. And also, I found it very interesting, thinking of Philip's and Dimitrios' talks, that you have a coexistence of very pre-modern religious-based anti-Judaism that Dimitrios talked about, that's focused, I mean, he didn't give us too many details about the tract, but it's clearly a blood libel, almost medieval kind of interpretation of anti-Judaism rather than anti-Semitism. I wouldn't even call that anti-Semitism. Whereas, as Philip mentioned, this notion of Jews having more privileges and rights than the Christians, which is a very modern, actually, even 21st century complaint about minority groups, is that they are having more privileges and rights than the majority population. And the coexistence of these two in 19th century Greece is quite interesting for me. I wonder if there were tensions between the two, if certain groups were more, I mean, what was the position of the church, for example? I mean, that's something I was missing in all three presentations. What did the Orthodox Church in Greece actually think about the Jews? And finally, well, I mean, I would also ask you, Dimitrios, about the number of copies that were circulated. If you have any idea, I mean, if you have ideas about how many copies of these editions were circulated, just to give us an idea of how popular this was. And also, I found it interesting that you talked about the two-way traffic between the center and the periphery, but I find a lot of traffic going on in the periphery itself, within the periphery. Because to the center, there's no German version, for example. And maybe it's very significant that there's no German version, because this is, once again, a pre-modern anti-Judaism tract rather than anything like modern anti-Semitism. And it goes to Italy and France and so on at the latest stage. First, sort of like spreads in the periphery itself, if you like to call it that. It spreads in peripheral spaces in languages that are not languages of the center, if you will. And finally, Maria's presentation, which I found very, very inspiring. My question was, okay, I sort of got the point of what's the dynamics of the Jewish socialists, but I was wondering what was the position of the Greek socialists towards the Jewish socialists in Salonika. So how was their reception by the I would assume that the majority of the Greek Communist Party was made of ethnic Greeks. So how did they perceive the Jewish socialists?
I would suggest
Sorry.
we go to Paul and Brandon, and then we answer it once.
Yeah, this is something both Philip and Dimitrios both brought up, but I guess it's something that all three of you can answer. It's just this question of historiography and why there has been this Greek exceptionalism, and I'm just wondering if you could give me some thoughts on maybe why you think this has arisen and how it's manifested itself, because it seemed this is sort of an introduction to me to sort of Greek Jewish history. So I guess you've all presented very sort of convincing cases and different nuanced accounts of anti-Semitism. I was just wondering how this exceptionalism can occur when it's clear from just this introduction that there is a lot to be said about anti-Semitism in Greece. Thanks.
Hi, I had a question for Maria. I simply loved your paper. I thought it was really, really excellent. And like Béla said, I really learned a lot from all three papers, but your one especially. I had a question, well, a comment and then a question. Something really struck me in what you said in this deep transformation from federal socialists to Jewish communists. This is like really extraordinary, because it seems that there's a mobilization of a Jewish communist political subjectivity as Jews, which, you know, going back to the old binary that we keep trying to escape, this is Jewish Jews, communism in the Deutscher sense. But what you then you described the united front of the oppressed that they helped to set up, of all minorities who are oppressed, which is absolutely the kind of classical internationalist, globalist kind of non-Jewish Jews Marxism that you find from, you know, all the classical tradition. So they seem to be really articulating. It goes back to the particularism universalism question, I guess, which Stefan described earlier. So I just loved that about the material. The question I had was, can you disaggregate the response of communists to anti-Semitism, both within the Jewish communist response to anti-Semitism? Are there different Jewish responses to Jewish communist responses to anti-Semitism, and how does this compare to non-Jewish responses to anti-Semitism, which I guess is a similar question to Raoul. So yeah, can you disaggregate the communist response to anti-Semitism, Jewish and non-Jewish?
Okay. The floor is yours.
Okay. I'll start with the easy, common question. The response of the church, none, silence, utter silence. The church officially has not castigated, kind of disagreed or expressed its opinion officially concerning whether a recent or past incidents of antisemitism, of anti-Semitic discourse and the like. The official position of the church on the issue of anti-Semitism is no such position exists. I'm not sure, no, I'll come to your point in a second. By proxy, yes, very much so. But then again, this is the whole, one of the, in my view at least, one of the principal tenets of anti-Semitism in its modern or modernistic guise is precisely that, the threat that the alleged Judification of any Christian society, not necessarily in terms of by the Jews themselves, but by all the identity markers and attributes that anti-Semites attributed to Jewry, whether this Jewry or these Jews were visible, both in terms of numbers or in terms of economic, financial, intellectual power, is a completely different story. So the by proxy concept and argument is, I think, valid, and certainly does appear to, it can be applied also in the Greek case. Greek exceptionalism, I don't think that either of the three of us made a case in favor of Greek exceptionalism. probably you have in mind Greek exceptionalism during the genocide, or if you would like to clarify what exactly you mean by Greek exceptionalism, because to me it's not clear.
Okay, yeah, it's the notion that there was no the notion that there was no anti-Semitism in Greece, or it's exceptionalism in that sense.
Sorry. Okay. Yes. This notion, this idea is a diachronical one. To be absolutely spot on here, it's a notion that, an idea that does not relate specifically or exclusively to the Jews as an entity with a minority status in the Greek state. Officially, even today, there are no ethnic minorities in Greece. The Turkish, with or without inverted commas, a minority in Western Thrace, in the Greek part of Thrace, is not considered an ethnic minority. It's not called a Turkish minority, it's called a Muslim minority. So the exceptionalism, quote unquote, is not necessarily attributed or exclusively attributed to the Jewish element. Why? Well, for a number of reasons, historical, but also more social ones, namely that there's this constant existence, I would say, of a kind of a societal insecurity, which can be demonstrated, can be explained either historically, and the usual idea that is put forward by those who espouse the view that there was no anti-Semitism in Greece ever, is that, well, Greece didn't pass through the Renaissance era because of the bloody 400 years of Ottoman rule, barbarity, backwardness, etc., etc. This has, throughout its existence as a modern state, as a modern nation, if you so wish, from the third decade of the 19th century onwards, this has cultivated this sense of insecurity, which is a collective one. Consider here, for example, the fact that the symbolism of the term Philhellenism. You know what is Philhellenism? Traditionally, those non-Greeks, mostly Europeans, mostly Westerners, that love Greece. What does that mean? Philhellenism is it a cultural concept? Is it a political one? And which other nation, which other people have such, have introduced into their vocabulary a term that distinguishes between friends of a given country or a given people and enemies? Think, which other people have this? The Jews. Because both are, in their own mind, consider themselves to be the chosen people. So even despite the existence of an anti-Semitism in Greece throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, and despite the fact that there are common points between the two cultures, I'm not talking about the religious attributes here, but the cultural attributes of the two people, these points of convergence have never been, as far as the Greek Orthodox are concerned, have never put forward as a manifest example that, yes, the two people can live together, and they should not, in the case of the Greeks, look at the Jews as their eternal enemies. And again, for me, this shows what I referred to earlier, namely this kind of societal insecurity. And there are also political considerations, particularly in the case of, and I will stop with that, particularly in the case of the Jews. There are also political considerations because there is a tendency among Greek officials, among Greek authorities, and therefore among those who espouse the views of Greek national historiography, to consider minority issues, those issues that do not exist, in the context of bilateral relations, and especially with the other arch eternal enemy, the Turks. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. The idea of Greek exceptionalism is it's quite a complex topic to kind of. I'll try to untangle it a little bit. Picking up on what Philip said about this idea of barbarity and this kind of collective insecurity. In many ways, I would supplement that by saying, in a sense, it's a collective angst. And this idea that one finds in Greece that one has to be civilized, in inverted commas, and civilization, modernity and the like is a concept from the beginnings of the state, which were culturally inscribed and attached to this notion of Europe. And it's an angst of, are we really Europeans or not? Are we? There's a whole grand discourse, and it's quite, my answer is not very adequate, but for example, one sees that with other peripheral nations as well. Russia is another example. Between Slavophiles and what the other category may be. Perhaps Brendan can talk about that, but I hope that kind of can put something, give some food for thought. Thank you, Raoul, for your question. Your point about why there isn't a German version is an extremely apt point, and I'm very, very grateful for that, because in a sense that puts other questions forward, because one does see the classic modernist anti-Semitism, the emergence of it, as being a German invention, whether we like it or not. Obviously, there are reasons why we still think in that way now, in reference to the Holocaust and Nazism and the like, but it's still a very important point. Your point about traffic between the periphery is again very apt, and that didn't come out of my paper, and it should actually, because the idea of a common Orthodox Balkan identity is something which the historiography, especially people like Kitromilidis, has brought out quite a lot. But again, he's brought out the positive aspect. When Korais, for example, translates all the works of Aristotle into the modern Greek vernacular, contemporary historiography still considers that to be, the great some great monument. But there is an avoidance of topics like this, which bring out the anti-Judaic element. Another particular work of the Enlightenment is Elliniki Nomarchia, I don't know if you've heard of that, in which Jews are depicted as being without a state, without a land, and the like. As for the official position of the Church, I just want to reiterate what Philip said. The 3 encyclicals that were ever brought out on what I'd call Jewish themes, for want of a better phrase, had to do with a folkloric practice, which was burning an effigy of Judas on either Good Friday or Easter Saturday. And ironically, one of the encyclicals was brought out in 1891, more or less at the same time as the Corfu blood libel, which one just wants to pull their hair out if you think that the official synod thought about that, when in the press in the Athenian press and the regional press of Greece, from more or less April or March, late March, through to June, the Corfu blood libel is front page material, as it is in the Western European press. I think that's all I have to say. I'll shut up now, please.
Okay. To Raul's question, I would like to address myself now. You mentioned, if I could a little bit elaborate on the relationship between the Jewish socialists and the non-Jewish Greek socialists. At the beginning at the emergence, at the first steps of this federation, the ethnic Greeks, so to say, viewed rather suspiciously this socialist organization, I believe to a certain extent because of the fact that it didn't treat the national question. And it did go in this way beyond the normal sensitivity of any ethnic Greek. No one, at the same time, however, this newspaper, Avanti, was published in all 4 newspapers at the beginning, Bulgarian and Slav Macedonian and Greek and Judeo-Spanish. However, when reflecting upon this difficult relationship, there is a lot of dynamism and evolution. So at the beginning, it was rather difficult, the coexistence. When Greece's entry, the issue of Greece's entry to the First World War was raised, and then the Greek socialists were also against a possible military embroilment in the Balkans. We have the first steps of a rapprochement with the Jewish socialists. We also have the leader of the Greek socialist movement at that time was defending their his Jewish comrades in the Saloniki who had been arrested and beaten up by the Greek authorities. On the other hand, the Greek non-Jewish, non-socialist class or a group of people, what Brannan said, you wanted to comment a little bit on how the Jews themselves, Jewish socialists themselves, viewed anti-Semitism and how the non-Jews viewed anti-Semitism. So, as I said, the Jewish socialists viewed anti-Semitism as a classical case of national ethnic minority oppression. In Salonika, in the Macedonian region, and I always put a lot of emphasis on the local factor, because this is a very obvious local particularity when studying Salonika Jewry. You can draw the same conclusions for Greek Jewry outside Salonika. Special conditions were there and asked for special answers adjusted to the special local conditions. On the other hand, the non-Jewish Greeks on a political level manipulated the issue of anti-Semitism, as I said, in a rather opportunistic way for electoral reasons, for paying their dues to the very large electorate body of the refugees. And that's why you have these contradictory Greek majority policies. There was not one line of Jewish politics followed by the Greek state in the interwar years. But this can only make sense when looking at all of it together and within hindsight.
Okay, I would like to close the panel now because we're exactly on time, or almost on time. But before I dismiss you, and I know that and I want to thank for this, for your presentations. I know that you're all exhausted. Nevertheless, I dare to invite you for our next program, which unfortunately is only in German. It's a literary presentation of a book written by a Hungarian author, Zoltán Halási. In English, the title is The Road to Empty Heaven. It's based on a poem in Yiddish on the destruction of the Polish people, of the Jewish people in Poland. It's in 19 chapters. It's an essay where this Hungarian author tells about what has been lost in the Shoah in Poland by the Shoah, by the destruction of the Nazis. And we had the possibility, it was published in Hungarian, then in Polish. A German translation is now being produced, and we got hold of the first chapters. We present them right around the corner in the Austrian Literary Museum. I know it's in German. It's going to be very impressive and very pressing. Afterwards, we invite you also for a small reception for cheese and wine. Maybe when you have the strength, then you still can discuss some of the topics we have raised today. Today was a very hard day. I promise it's only getting better because tomorrow we only have 2 panels. I think nevertheless they are very interesting panels. One still on symbolic imagination and the other one on the socio-economic factors. I'm going to chair the first one, so I'm going to be here for sure, and I'm expecting and inviting you also to be here for the final chapters, and then there will be a conclusion by Raul and Eva on the conference proceedings. Thank you very much for your patience. Hope you come to the literary presentation in German. Thank you. Thank you very much. A lot of questions.